Dr. Shane Westfall, professor of psychology here at Western. Usually when I mention that I do psychology, people assume that I do some sort of counseling or therapy or something like that, and no, that's not the type of psychologist I am. Instead, I'm a research psychologist. So what I do is I think of interesting questions about humanity, I find ways to experiment with that, and if I find any interesting results, then I write those up for publications. So I'm actually more like a writer rather than somebody who might provide therapy. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the physiology of the criminal mind. We know that on the outside, violent offenders come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, ages. But on the inside, research is finding that they share some physiological traits in common. So today we're going to take a look at some of those physiological characteristics that are known as risk factors. And then if we have time at the end, we'll look at some interventions that can perhaps reduce that risk. So, first question you may have then is, what is physiology? Physiology is the branch of biology that deals with the normal functions of living organisms and their parts. So definitely a biological perspective. If it's a branch of biology, why do they have a psychologist in here talking about it? Any thoughts? Well, psychology is actually a fairly new discipline. Until the late 19th century, there weren't any psychology labs on any campuses. It wasn't until the late 1800s that psychology became a discipline of its own. But of course, we've been asking these same questions for hundreds of years. It wasn't like we just woke up 200 years ago and decided, hey, I wonder how people work. Psychology's parents then are physiology, that biological perspective, and philosophy. So if you take biology, philosophy, mash them up, that gives you a good idea of what we do as psychologists. And I'll argue a few times through this presentation that biology and philosophy are linked, that you really can't cleanly separate the two. Perhaps you survived a philosophy class. Does anybody have any clue who this guy may be? Yeah, Descartes, yes, great answer. And Descartes was primarily known as a philosopher. If you've ever heard that expression, I think, therefore I am, he's the guy that came up with it. He started with this deductive method in which he would try and figure out what he knew for certain, and then once you know something for certain, you can kind of build on that information. Even though Descartes was a philosopher, he was also very interested in biology. He didn't have the technology we have today, but he certainly had the curiosity, and so he tried to understand the human nervous system. Now, he got a lot of it right, and he got a lot of it really wrong. He thought that the nervous system was a series of tubes that went throughout our body and connected to our brain. That's a little simplified, but yeah, he was on the right track there. Where he kind of went off the rails, he didn't understand what neurons were, he didn't understand how neurons worked, so he thought that there must be animal spirits inside those tubes. Whenever I wave my arms around or step around back and forth, Descartes thought the animal spirits moved through the tubes, helped my body move around. And yeah, as silly as that sounds, by explaining animal and human behavior in these mechanical terms, well, he not only made the study of animals legitimate, but he linked together that biology and that philosophy that we still combine today in psychology. So in the next couple slides, we're going to look at a few historical perspectives on the biology of crime. And each of these perspectives, much like Descartes, got some stuff really right, they got some stuff really wrong. Unlike psychology, with criminal justice, especially the scientific study of crime, we can actually pinpoint the exact year, even the exact time when this scientific study of crime began. Our guy here, Cesare Lombroso, was a psychiatrist as well as a prison doctor, and he was performing a routine autopsy on a well-known criminal back in 1871. It was a November evening. Most texts describe it as like cold and eerie. It seems like, just an attempt at foreshadowing there. But on this night in 1871, as he was performing this autopsy, he noticed that this criminal had some unusual bumps in the back of his skull. Based on that single observation, Lombroso decided that perhaps everything we knew about crime was wrong. Up until that point, there was more of a classical approach to crime that asserted that we're all just criminals, that crime is just a part of human nature, and things such as laws or religion are the only things that stop us from all violently killing each other right now. Well, Lombroso didn't buy that, especially after this observation. Social Darwinism was becoming very popular at the time as well. And Lombroso formulated this anthropological theory of crime in which he suggested that we could identify criminals based, to a large degree, on deformities in the brain. That's something that, we'll find some more support for a few slides down the road. Now, where he also went off the rails is that he felt that people who engaged in crime were some sort of evolutionary throwback. He thought people who engaged in crime weren't as well developed as people who were crime-free. And to be blunt, our guy Lombroso here was blatantly racist. Now, you may have noticed in your life, whenever racists make hierarchies, where do they put themselves and people like themselves? Usually kind of at the top, right? And so that's exactly what Lombroso did. He suggested that in his evolutionary hierarchy, Northern Italians and Jewish people were at the top of this hierarchy. And Southern Italians, as well as Bolivians and Peruvians, they weren't quite as well developed. They were at the bottom of this hierarchy. Lombroso then was a celebrated intellectual during his day. He did make some advances there, noticing these brain abnormalities. But his theory was also, scientifically and socially disastrous. It helped, I don't want to say create, but lend support to the eugenics movement that was very popular at the time. There was a lot of conversation during that time about who should be allowed to reproduce and who shouldn't be. And Lombroso was suggesting, hey, we can identify the air quote good people versus the air quote bad people. And unsurprisingly, that's a large part of why his theory grew out of favor. Another thing his theory supported was a pseudoscientific movement at the time known as phrenology. So phrenology, today is definitely recognized as a pseudoscience, but it involves the measurements of bumps on the head. Our phrenologists, again, got something very right. They realized that certain portions of the brain were involved in different activities, that parts of your brain are involved in emotion, parts of your brain are involved in problem solving. Where they got it wrong, though, was they thought that by measuring the exterior of the skull, we could predict your personality traits. If a certain region of the brain was involved in emotion and your brain, or your skull rather, was bumpier in that area, you must be a more emotional person. This theory was very popular during the early 1800s, but even then the scientific community never really did embrace it. You can think of it as very much like astrology and reading your horoscope. That's still popular with many people, but you won't find a lot of scientific support for it. So our phrenologists, they're getting some stuff right, and they're getting some stuff really wrong. William Sheldon, he was an American, born in the late 1800s, died in the 1970s. And this guy makes me feel like a slacker. He went to the University of Chicago, got his PhD in psychology, and immediately went back to medical school and got his MD. So he was both a psychologist as well as a doctor. He did some work classifying people according to their body types. And in his view, he thought that humans could be classified into 3 basic body types. All right, maybe I can go along with him there. But he also thought that our body type predicted what kind of human we were going to be. So of his 3 types, he had the endomorphs. That would be, over here. Nope, over there. I guess I should have looked at the slide before I pointed. Our endomorphs have a body that's more rounded and soft. And Sheldon thought that these individuals tend to be more relaxed, more extroverted, more comfortable around others. On the other end, he had the ectomorphs. This time I'll point at the skinny figures. These are people who are thin and small-boned, and he thought they had a tendency to be more introverted, thoughtful, inhibited, and sensitive. And finally, we have that mesomorph. These are people who are square and muscular. Sheldon reached the conclusion that these people with this muscular body were more likely to be aggressive, they were more likely to be assertive, and they were more likely to engage in criminality. His work identifying different body types is still used a lot in the medical community. Fitness groups often build different diet plans based on that body type. But there's no support for this conclusion that our body type predicts what kind of human we're going to be. If you happen to be muscular, nobody believes what Sheldon suggested, that you're going to run out and slaughter us all today. Some have suggested he used a very small sample size, that he didn't really look at that many people or talk to that many people, so that led to that easy conclusion. Other scientists have criticized him for being, I guess you could say conflating correlation for causation. Just because we have a few muscular people who also happen to be aggressive, there's no evidence to support the notion that being muscular is what causes them to be aggressive. So again, Sheldon, he provides us some insight, but doesn't tell us a very complete picture. Regardless of what approach one takes, though, we consistently find a relationship between aggressiveness and criminal behavior. Now, that's not suggesting, again, that if you're an aggressive human, you're going to run out and become a criminal. But we do find that the vast majority of criminals, particularly violent criminals, tend to have high levels of aggression. So, what's aggression? We'll go ahead and define aggression as intentional behavior aimed at causing harm to another person that the target person wants to avoid. So it does have to be intentional. If you accidentally run over your boyfriend's foot, that's not aggression. If you accidentally do it every time you get mad at him, that probably is. It doesn't have to be successful. If you're trying to kill me, but you just happen to be a bad shot and you keep missing, that's still aggression. So you don't have to be good at it. It doesn't have to be physical aggression. It can be verbal or psychological aggression, other attempts to cause harm. I'll return to that in just a moment. And if the target person wants you to hurt them, that's not considered aggression. I'll let you ponder that one and figure it out. All of the classic research looking at aggression consistently found that men are more aggressive than women. But most of those approaches only focused on that physical aggression. Relational and social aggression, these are other ways we could attempt to cause someone harm. These include things like malicious gossip, backstabbing, just telling lies about people, using other, perhaps verbal attempts to cause other humans harm. And we find that women are actually more likely to engage in relational aggression than men are. When we consider all types of aggression, some studies still find a small gender gap, others don't find a gender gap at all. But the idea seems to be that both men and women find a type of aggression that works best for their physical type. Our question then becomes, is aggression just an instinct, something that we have within us, perhaps in varying levels? Or is aggression something we learn from our culture? And this has some pretty significant ramifications. I mean, criminologists, really society as a whole, we try and structure society in a way that it reduces aggression. That only works, though, if aggression is something that we learn from others. If aggression is just this instinct we have, our attempts at social engineering are not very effective. I'm guessing we've all at least heard of Sigmund Freud, even if we don't know that much about him. He's usually associated with psychology, although he never actually was a psychologist. He was, you can guess, a doctor, an Austrian physician, and he had a lot of patients coming to him with psychological disorders. There really wasn't a lot of treatment for that at the time, so he started developing his talk therapies in an attempt to help these people who, showed up seeking help. Freud definitely believed that aggression was instinctual. Yeah, that's the word I wanted today. Again, think of instincts as innate inborn tendencies. Much like the people we've touched on a few slides ago, Sigmund Freud came up with some brilliant ideas, things that are still cornerstones of psychology today. He also came up with some absolute coked up garbage. And that stuff's interesting to talk about, but not a lot of research supporting it. So for Freud to have this notion that aggression was instinctual, he thought we had two conflicting instincts that were our primary drivers as humans. He thought, one, we had this constructive, life-giving, and being Freud, very sexual, positive instinct. That's what he called eros. He also thought we had this very destructive instinct where we wanted to essentially kill people, and he called that thanatos. It's really not too much of an oversimplification to say that Freud felt we went through our entire lives wanting to either hit or hump every human we meet. Now, you can't do that on campus, right? I'm guessing not. And so, at least according to Freud, that's what causes a lot of our anxiety, because we do have these pin-up instincts that we're unable to fill. Whether you buy into that part of Freudian philosophy or not, I'll leave that entirely up to you. But we do find a lot of variation in aggression. We find that different cultures approach aggression differently. The consequences, different cultures tend to be more or less aggressive than others. And for something to be an instinct, again, we should see it nearly universally. Perhaps, there would be a few outliers, but it does seem to indicate that there's at least some cultural component to aggression, that part of that we're at least picking up from others. We are consistently finding, though, that there are genetic influences when it comes to aggression. You may wonder how psychologists are able to explore genetic influences, especially if we can't discover the exact gene responsible for something. What is typically used, we look at concordance rates. Once that clicks, there we go, of conditions and genetic overlap. Now, this chart's looking at schizophrenia. That's what I happened to have handy when I was throwing this PowerPoint together. The odds of having schizophrenia in the general population are a little less than 1%. So a little less than 1% of us have schizophrenia. If, for example, then, one of you in this room has schizophrenia, and of course I don't know, and we grabbed another random human that you're unrelated to, there's going to be very little chance that that other individual is going to have schizophrenia as well. Let's go to the top of that chart, though. What about for identical twins? Now remember, identical twins are the result of one egg, one sperm. It splits in the womb. Identical twins have 100% genetic overlap. So if you have an identical twin, you can go commit murder and set them up for it. You've got the same DNA. And if your identical twin has schizophrenia, then you have almost a 50% chance of having it yourself. If you're the offspring of two schizophrenic parents, yeah, it's Monday, you have 50% genetic overlap with both of them, and that gives you about a 45% chance of having schizophrenia. As we move down, you'll notice that this concordance rate goes down in conjunction with the reduction in genetic overlap. When we see a nice pretty chart like this, that gives us pretty strong evidence that something genetic is going on there. Going back to criminology, there have been over 100 different studies using twins and adoption. Adoption studies are very useful in that they allow us to kind of tease apart the biological factors from the environmental factors. So there have been over 100 different studies looking at twins and adopted children. And those 100 studies have confirmed that roughly 50% of the variance in aggression and criminality seems to be genetic in origin. That is to say, if you come from a family of violent criminals, you're not necessarily going to become a criminal, but it increases the odds that you'll be a violent criminal. We know, for example, that other humans can be, or not other humans, other animals can be selectively bred to make them more aggressive. Think of fighting cocks or pit bulls. Neither by nature are necessarily aggressive, but we can selectively breed them to make them more aggressive individuals. And it's strongly suggested by these studies that genetic influences don't necessarily cause one to be aggressive, but they affect our sensitivity to aggressive cues. So if one has a genetic predisposition to be more aggressive, they're likely to see things as more threatening, whereas other people might see them as more peaceful. And again, all it does is increase the likelihood. You can compare it to, having a genetic predisposition for alcoholism. If you come from a long line of alcoholics, you're not necessarily going to be an alcoholic, but it does increase the statistical likelihood. And that's what we have going on here with genetics. Moving on to some more recent research from the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of new technology was coming online then, and so biochemical research was trying to identify specific factors that increase your likelihood to engage in criminal activity. One of those is serotonin levels. Serotonin is a chemical that your nerves produce to communicate. It's a neurotransmitter. It allows those signals to go between nerve cells. Serotonin is made up of amino acids that we typically get in our diet. Most of it comes from proteins, nuts, red meat, cheeses. If you're not getting enough of those amino acids in your diet, that can result in mood disorders such as anxiety and depression. All of us are going to have some variation in our serotonin levels as we go through life. So again, it's based on diet as well as stress, external factors. You can think of that as your state serotonin level, how much you have at this given moment. But we also find that there are trait differences in serotonin levels. Some individuals naturally have more serotonin than others. Some individuals naturally have lower levels of serotonin than others. Well, there was a study done in the 1980s in Finland, and the researcher had a hunch that perhaps serotonin levels were associated with criminality. Yes, he found exactly what he expected to find, which is why I'm talking about it. But using a prison population, he found that the prisoners who were there for violent crimes had naturally lower levels of serotonin. Based on that research, a wider study was done comparing several different nations. This was done in the 90s. And again, the same finding occurred, that having those lower levels of serotonin was associated not just with more crime, but with more violent crime. Testosterone. We probably all heard of this. It's the primary sex hormone in males, in male humans. It plays a key role in the development of sexual organs. And it also helps to create some of those secondary sex characteristics. Things that are not necessary for sexual reproduction. Things like body hair, that lowering of the voice. But every human has testosterone. Men have significantly more than women, but again, everyone has this. And again, research looking at prisoners has found prisoners that are in jail for violent crimes tend to have higher levels of serotonin, testosterone, that's the point we're on. Higher levels of testosterone compared to both the general population as well as prisoners who are in jail for nonviolent crimes. Following that up in laboratory paradigms, experiments, we find that when people win at competitions or when people win at dominance trials, there's a spike in that testosterone. So much like serotonin, testosterone levels vary as we go through life. But again, we find that if humans have elevated levels of testosterone, they're more likely to engage in violent criminal behavior. The autonomic nervous system. Well, unlike what Descartes suggested, we don't have animal spirits running through our arms. The autonomic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that handles a lot of the automatic functions, respiration, heart rate, the parts of your nervous system that you never really think about. The autonomic nervous system has two opposing moods, if you will. I often compare it to a dimmer switch. If one goes up, the other one is reduced or eliminated. If we increase the other one, that first one is reduced or eliminated. These two are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. That sympathetic nervous system is what prepares you for that fight or flight syndrome. So if you're out hiking in the woods and you encounter a scary bear, you should have some sort of fight or flight syndrome that's going to prepare you to fight the bear or outrun your friends or climb a tree or do something. Well, research looking at violent offenders has found that they have a slower reaction time in that autonomic nervous system. What's automatic for us, we see the bear, we go running or fighting, they have a lag time, a period where they can either consciously or non-consciously ponder what they should do during that time period. So instead of there being that automatic function that most of us have when encountering danger, they don't seem to have a strong or, in some cases, there's not present this automatic response. Now these factors, again, do not determine that a person will absolutely commit crime. In fact, the majority of people who have the three factors I just described are never going to engage in violent crime. But human personality is a lot like gambling. It's looking at statistical odds. And for each one of these risk factors, if they're present, the statistical odd of that person becoming a violent criminal is much higher than people who don't have those factors. So circling back to those first two slides, we also find some anatomical differences in brains when we compare violent offenders to nonviolent offenders or people who are not criminals. A lot of the research has focused on the amygdala. The amygdala is a part of the brain that's involved in fear, it's involved in aggression, it's involved in social interactions. It also helps us store information that's associated with fear. It's believed that in many cases, if one has a phobia, it's because at some point in their life, there was some sort of fearful event, and that information is stored in that amygdala. So some research at the University of Pittsburgh examined 26-year-old men, and they looked at the volume of the amygdala, just how much amygdala you actually have there. They found that the men who had the lower levels of amygdala volume were 3 times more likely to commit violent crimes compared to individuals who have normal amygdalas, suggesting a reduction in amygdala volume makes one more likely to engage in crime. Other research, this conducted at the University of Alabama, looked at amygdala functioning. An fMRI is a very expensive toy that tracks oxygenated blood. And the underlying assumption is that if a part of your body needs oxygenated blood, that's the part of your body that's functioning in a given task. Well, these researchers at the University of Alabama used the fMRI, and they were looking at the amygdala function in both psychopathic individuals versus, air quote, normal individuals. What they found was that the psychopathic individuals had a reduced function in the amygdala. So it seems having less amygdala is associated with crime, as well as having less function of the amygdala. Another study in 2009 looked at psychopaths and compared our psychopaths to non-psychopaths. They discovered that the amygdala in the psychopathic individuals was thinner. It had a smaller outer layer. So a reduction in volume, a reduction in function, a reduction in that outer layer is all implicated with criminal activity. And one more study I'll touch on about the amygdala before moving on. It's both exciting and really frightening depending on how you look at it. Some researchers at the University of Pennsylvania brought in almost 2,000 3-year-old kids. And they tracked their fear response to this loud tone. It's supposed to scare these kids when they hear this loud tone out of nowhere. They found that a small percentage of the kids did not demonstrate this fear response. The loud tone occurred, they should be fearful, they're not fearful. They tracked these kids over a 20-year period, and at the age of 23 discovered almost all of the kids who did not have that fear response ended up being arrested for violent crimes. So yeah, the suggestion there was that at age 3, there's at least the potential to identify those who might go on to become violent criminals later in life. A few other parts of the brain I'll touch on fairly quickly, I suppose. The anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, is kind of like a horseshoe-shaped band. We've got these thick fibers that connect the two sides of our brain, the corpus callosum. And at the back of the brain, there's this little horseshoe-shaped area that surrounds those tissues. This ACC is linked with things such as impulse control, things like regulation of your attention, being able to sit here through a talk instead of, getting bored or playing with your phone or whatever the case may be. Well, a researcher at the University of New Mexico used that fMRI again to track the oxygenated blood. And they were able to identify some people who had less activity in that ACC. The individuals with less activity there were 4 times more likely to be arrested for another offense. So again, suggesting that less activity in that region of the brain is associated with criminality. And a couple more brain parts. The frontal gyrus. This is a portion of the brain near the front, somewhere about here, if you will, or if you want to look at the sheep brain later, it's right about here. It's involved in higher thinking tasks, such as working memory. You can think of our working memory as much like the working memory in your computer. It's processing power. It's how quickly you're able to get things done. Some research at the Mayo Clinic found that individuals arrested for violent crimes had about an 18% reduction in volume. This area of the brain is smaller compared to air quote normal humans. And finally, the prefrontal cortex. This is the very front of your brain, right up here. It's involved in self-control. I mentioned this in a lot of my classes. That region of the brain doesn't finish developing until around the age of 25. That at least partially explains why late adolescents and young adults may engage in riskier behavior. You know, it's usually not people my age who decide to wake up one day and go surfing on the tops of cars. But yeah, probably did that when I was younger. And so that's because that prefrontal cortex hasn't finished developing. And again, there have been a pair of studies finding that the prefrontal cortex is smaller. It has less volume in violent criminals. So we've gone through a few factors supported by current research. Much like Lambrosco suggested, there do seem to be some anatomical differences in the brains of violent criminals versus people who are not violent criminals. And we also see that neurotransmitters as well as hormones may play a role in that as well. So, I forgot to throw that one in last night. Thus far, we've been talking about naturally developed brains, whether they resemble other human brains or not. They've been developing naturally. But there are also traumatic brain injuries, also thought of as concussions. These are fairly common, especially in young people. If you play contact sports, if you get a riskier physical occupation, if you, get an accident, fall off your motorcycle, all of these things can lead to TBIs. One study looked at school children and found that school children who received traumatic brain injuries were more likely to become delinquent children, drop out of school. It was associated with more drug use later. That led to a study in England looking at prisoners. And overwhelmingly, they found that the majority, not just a higher percentage, but the majority of violent criminals in England had suffered some traumatic brain injuries later in life. I'm not going to bore you with too many statistics because some of you who have classes with me know that I can babble about statistics all day. But a mediator variable, also known as mediation, is something that creates a path for something else to occur. So we can think of TBIs as serving as a moderator variable. Let's say we have a human over here that's fairly aggressive, but they're not necessarily a criminal individual. It's unlikely that's necessarily going to lead to violent crime. If we throw in that concussion, that traumatic brain injury, that can serve as a path. That aggression plus that traumatic brain injury can lead to increased criminality. Again, just because you get a concussion this weekend, that doesn't mean you're going to wake up and slaughter us all next weekend. It does just suggest that, well, overall, we see a lot of personality changes if somebody has severe traumatic brain injuries, and that can lead to an increase in criminality. Let's go to that one. So what do we do about this? We've known for quite some time, researchers in developmental psychology, that nutritional deficiencies often lead to conduct problems. You often see kind of a cycle in low-income neighborhoods in that individuals who are not receiving proper nutrition often act up in school. That can be directly related to an iron deficiency. Of course, if someone gets on a track being identified as a problem student, it can be hard for them to get back from something that really is just diet-related. Building on that, some researchers instituted an enrichment program for 3-year-olds that focused on nutrition, exercise, as well as cognitive skills. This study also followed these kids into their 20s, and compared to a control group that did not receive this enrichment program, arrests for violent crime went down 34% in the kids who just got a program focusing on how to be healthy. To build on that, that same model was used with prisoners, Again, we're in England here, giving some of the prisoners vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids. And those prisoners that received the nutritional enrichment, their rearrest rate went down 27%. Something as simple as giving people, the vitamins their body actually needs. So there definitely seems to be some support for providing people with some sort of nutritional enrichment. That's relatively low in cost. It's kind of hard to argue that much against that. If we run into Daisy Moore today on campus, let her know that a 10-week yoga class has been found to improve impulse control in prisoners as well. So kind of the overall idea here is that we can change the brain to change behavior. If we are looking at neurological or in some cases structural differences in the brain, then we can ponder ways to try and create a brain that is a little more close to air quote normal to reduce that criminality. And the last thing I was going to touch on were some kind of ethical quandaries. I mean, what we've talked about for the last half hour is that we can use fMRIs and other technology to identify very small kids and predict which one of those kids will go on to become criminal. That doesn't necessarily mean they will, but again, it's just like rolling the dice in Vegas. So what are people comfortable with then? I mean, if it is a structural problem with the brain, there's certainly surgical options that can correct those, but I'm guessing most of you have a problem with performing surgery on small kids who haven't done anything wrong yet. Yeah, not a lot of support for that, right? What about therapy? We know that therapeutic interventions can be helpful as well, helping small children learn better impulse control. But again, these are hypothetical consequences down the road. That kid hasn't done anything, air quote, wrong yet. Do we think therapy is justified? Of course, I'll leave that up to you to decide. And then finally, supplements. Yeah, I'm kind of on board with this. I mean, whether they grow up to be criminals or not, it seems like a good idea to provide people with proper nutrition. So especially given the data that strongly finds supplements help. And then finally, there's a question about culpability. Kind of a cornerstone of the American justice system is that people have free will. We can certainly argue about that at any given point, but if people are choosing to commit crime versus not choosing to commit crime, then of course I think we're all on board with punishing them. But what if people are committing crime just because of structural differences in their brain or neurotransmitter levels that they were born with? In many instances, it could be almost compared to a dog with rabies, an individual who doesn't choose to commit any crime. So that's kind of the point I want to leave you pondering there is, to what degree is someone punishable for something that's just consistent with the way their body is? And now I'll take questions. Yes?
So why has it been found that yoga, why yoga in specific changes behavior? Why not any other exercise?
That's a great question. I suspect we would find that other exercise would produce that same effect. Honestly, yoga's kind of trendy. And so it's easy to get funding if you want to get people to do a yoga program versus, long distance running perhaps. But I'm pretty confident if we did some digging, we would find evidence that other exercise does help as well.
So they just tested yoga, it's not, they had a variety of other exercises.
That particular study only used yoga versus a control group.
Does yoga produce more serotonin?
I would say yes, but I don't believe compared to other forms of exercise, depending on the exercise.
Right, because running would probably be
Yeah, I would think so.
Dr. Westfall, will you
Sure.
repeat the question so that I can catch the recording?
Oh, sure. The first question was, did they look at any other types of exercise or only yoga? And the answer was that particular study only looked at yoga. As far as the reason they only looked at yoga, I don't know. I didn't design that study. But I suspect we would find that other types of exercise would produce some of these same results. A lot of it has to do with internal focus, relaxation, that sort of thing. Now, if, I work out in the garage with a heavy bag, I'm not sure that's going to, cause me happy, peaceful feelings. But then the follow-up question, we discussed things such as running, and I think the suggestion was that running would probably produce some of the same effects. I guess a good thing about yoga is you don't really have to have any specialized equipment, and you don't need a large space either. So, if we've got prisoners, there's not necessarily a lot of room to go long distance running. That's a great question. Other questions? No other questions. All right, you guys need this Q code that's on this last slide.